You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O, Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is... Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have Elena Gorokhova on the show with me. She has an amazing new book. It's her debut novel, but she is not a debut author, and we'll talk all about that in a few moments. It's called A Train to Moscow, and what a fantastic book this is. We have talked about some really great books here lately, and this one is right at the top of my list. I'm telling everyone about it. It releases on March 1st. When you're hearing this, then the book should have been out for about a day or so. And I want you to run out, grab a copy, and buy one for a friend. It's one of those kinds of books. Welcome to the show, Elena.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'm excited to have you. Elena, we begin each show with the same question. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, I if I think back, I was raised in the Soviet Union, in Soviet Russia, and somewhere around maybe third grade, when I was about 10, and in Russia, school starts at 7. We were all young pioneers. I had a red scarf around my neck like everyone else. And when I was about 10, I remember writing a story that was set in a young pioneer camp where we all went in the summers. I was creating some kind of a very young pioneer story at the time. But I have to say that we were raised on a wealth of Russian literature. Even from the earliest grades, we read Chekhov, and Chekhov wrote a lot of stories for children that may not be known in this country, and Pushkin did too.
That's news to me.
Yeah, he wrote children's stories, and Pushkin wrote fairy tales that we read in first and second grade. So there was this wealth of literature, and I thought everyone wanted to be a writer, because how could you not?
Right.
and then, of course, at 14 or 15, I wrote poems. Again, like all my friends wanted to be like Yesenin and Mayakovsky and Pushkin and Lermontov. So there was, I guess that's where it started.
Wow. So Elena, you grew up in Russia, like you mentioned, and immigrated to the U.S. How did that happen?
Well, that happened when I was 24. I graduated from the University of Leningrad, and I got married. I married an American citizen, and that's how I came to the United States. And the story was I majored in English at the university, and I thought I knew English when I came to this country. And I realized that the English that we were taught at the university was British English, well, first of all. So the vocabulary, the pronunciation, and the culture itself, everything was completely different. And I also came from behind the Iron Curtain, literally. We knew nothing about the West. There was the Iron Curtain, which was permanently closed at that time. And I really didn't know what to expect. I had no idea what anything looked like, what people sounded like. I didn't know what the culture was like. I didn't know any, even common courtesy, because in Russia, everyone is very at that time was very much into him or herself, and people were protecting their own territory. It was a totalitarian regime, of course, as you know. So I was in culture shock for the first, not even months, I would say for the first couple of years, before I learned how to behave and what to expect. And the notion of choice was overwhelming, because in Soviet Russia, there was no choice. Even in consumer goods, even in stores, the stores had empty shelves. And if the shelves were not empty, they were filled with, gray shoes that mangled your feet, for example.
Mm-hmm.
It was mass production. Everything was the same. There was nothing to choose from. So when I came into an American supermarket, an American department store, it was overwhelming. It took time to get used to. So that's, relearning English, learning American English, learning to write in English. I thought I could write in English, but of course I learned I couldn't. And that took years.
Yeah. You bring up such a fascinating point. Learning a language, or shall I say, language without culture is only half the story, isn't it? I have a friend who is German, and he grew up in Germany, but he became acquainted with English through American television and music. MTV, especially in the 80s, was a great cultural bridge, because you got language, but you also got a bit of the culture with it, which then helps to get the language right, because you could be technically correct with the language, but without any of the context that goes around the language, it almost still doesn't work, does it?
Oh, that is so true, so true. And maybe, yes, you're absolutely right. That's why I was so uncomfortable for the first few years, because I knew some of the language. I knew the structure of the language. I knew the grammar and the sentence structure and the tenses and how to spell most of the time, but it wasn't enough, because the culture aspect was completely unknown to me, and that's why there was this disconnect. I could be linguistically, I could say something linguistically correct and people would understand me, but I had no references, no cultural references. I had no knowledge of the culture, and that was this disconnect was very difficult to overcome for the first few years.
Wow. So Elena, you come to the States, you marry an American, and it's all culture shock, and you're learning a new culture and learning the common application of a new language that you already technically knew. So there comes a point when you start to become comfortable in your new life, and you start turning back to writing, and you began with a memoir called A Mountain of Crumbs. Where did that book come from, and what was the motivation to get that story out?
It came very slowly to me. It took, if I count the years it took to write that memoir, the first memoir, it's probably it would come to something like 15 at least, because I was learning the language first. I was learning how to write in English, in American English, but more than that, I didn't dare think that anything I could write in a second language could possibly be published. But I kept writing anyway. And at that time, the Russian expression is to write into a drawer. And a lot of Soviet writers or writers who lived under the Soviet system wrote into the drawer, which means they wrote for themselves and they put it in the drawer because they knew it could never be published. The Soviet Union would never publish that kind of writing. dissident writing about the Gulag, things like that, writing the truth. So that's what I was doing for a different reason. I was just writing it because I had to write it down. And there is a sort of this famous phrase that Chekhov once said, and it sounds in Russian, "Если можешь не писать, не пиши," which means if you can live without writing, do not write. And I think it's a very good piece of advice.
It's a fantastic piece of advice.
Yeah, right. But I found that I guess I could not live without writing. So I wrote these little pieces about my life, my recollections, my memories of childhood. And I wrote them and I kept writing them. And then at some point, and I know when that point actually was, it was in 2004 when I signed up for a memoir workshop with Frank McCourt, the author of Angela's Ashes. And I was accepted miraculously into his workshop. And that's when he almost gave me, it was a very small workshop, 12 people. It was a very intense workshop. And Frank McCourt was, you can imagine, was a marvelous teacher, marvelous storyteller. Yeah. But it's almost, in that workshop, he gave me permission to write. He said something encouraging to me that allowed me to think that my writing was not that awful and that I could actually say something and write something and maybe even be published. And after that workshop, I submitted several of the pieces that I had written to different literary magazines, and they were all published. So that's when there was this breakthrough after that workshop that happened to my writing. And I now had this, these stashed chapters that became the chapters of my first memoir. And then it all came together after that, gradually. And the first memoir was published in the end of 2009. But it did take all those years to get it together, to become ready, sort of psychologically become ready to submit my writing somewhere to an agent, to find an agent. And then, and I'm grateful to Frank McCourt for giving me that permission, for allowing me to write, and for becoming my mentor. I do consider him my mentor because of that workshop.
That's fantastic. So after that book, you wrote and released another memoir called Russian Tattoo. I'm always fascinated by memoir because unlike a biography or autobiography, which tends to cover all of a person's life as much as we can realistically cover, memoir usually looks at a certain window of time. It gives you a glance into a certain aspect of someone's life, or maybe a particular time period, or something like that. It's usually very focused. When you wrote these two books, how did you choose which parts of your life you really wanted to focus on?
What a great question. Again, I'm going to quote someone. I'm going to quote Frank McCourt, and he taught us a lot of things in this memoir workshop, but one of the things that he taught us was something that he called hot spots. And the hot spots are those times in your life when something happened that changed everything. After that point, you are no longer the same. So his advice to us, writers of memoirs, was look for hot spots, look for those important moments in life when you changed, or something changed you or something made you change. And he compared memoir writing, to walking on a beach with a metal detector. So you imagine you walk and you have this metal detector, and then it rings, and you have to dig deeply. You have to go down to get that gold, that
Right.
important scene, that important moment in your life. And we all have to dig for it. We all have to resist ourselves. These are his words. When you write a memoir, you resist yourself. You go into an uncomfortable territory that maybe we try to suppress in our memory. But that moment, that territory, that event that changes you profoundly. And because it is very often difficult and painful, he said, when you write a memoir, we stare down the monsters, we stare at the monsters, and we fight our the devils. The word that he used were monsters and devils. We have to face them, and we have to deal with them, and we have to put them down on paper. And only when you are willing to look into the face of all those difficult moments, difficult hot spots, that's when you achieve the truth. That's when you can write something that will resonate with your readers.
Things We Never Got Over, the new book by best-selling author Lucy Score. Bearded bad boy barber Knox refers to live his life the way he takes his coffee, alone, unless you count his basset hound Waylon. Knox doesn't tolerate drama even when it comes in the form of a stranded runaway bride. Naomi wasn't just running away from her wedding. She was riding to the rescue of her estranged twin to Knockemout, Virginia, a rough-around-the-edges town where disputes are settled the old-fashioned way, with fist and beer, usually in that order. Too bad for Naomi, her evil twin hasn't changed at all. After helping herself to Naomi's car and cash, Tina leaves her with something unexpected, the niece Naomi didn't know she had. Now she's stuck in town with no car, no job, no plan, and no home, with an 11-year-old going on 30 to take care of. There's a reason Knox doesn't do complications or high-maintenance women, especially not the romantic ones. But since Naomi's life imploded right in front of him, the least he can do is help her out of her jam. And just as soon as she stops getting into new trouble, he can leave her alone and get back to his peaceful, solitary life. At least that's the plan until the trouble turns to real danger. Things We Never Got Over, the new book by best-selling author Lucy Score. An Innocent Client, the first book in the Joe Dillard legal thriller series. A preacher is found brutally murdered in a Tennessee motel room. A beautiful, mysterious young girl is accused. In this best-selling debut, criminal defense lawyer Joe Dillard has become jaded over the years as he's tried to balance his career against his conscience. Savvy but cynical, Dillard wants to quit doing criminal defense, but he can't resist the chance to represent someone who might actually be innocent. His drug-addicted sister has just been released from prison, and his mother is succumbing to Alzheimer's, but Dillard's commitment to the case never wavers despite the personal troubles and professional demands that threaten to destroy him. Chosen by BookBub readers as one of the top 100 crime novels of all time, get started on this great series with An Innocent Client, where it all started. Read for free with Kindle Unlimited or buy it in paperback or audiobook. An Innocent Client by Scott Pratt. So after publishing the two memoirs, you now turn your eye toward fiction, and A Train to Moscow is your first novel, your first work of fiction. I often wonder if writing fiction is easier or harder than writing memoir, and what I mean by that is that making up a story about fictional characters sometimes can seem on the surface like it's easier because you can just make them up and you don't have any personal connection to them. Whereas writing memoir, forces you to do the work of, the illustration you had of the metal detector is fascinating. I love that because, it forces you to dig deep where those hot spots are. And sometimes digging deep into our own life and experiences is uncomfortable. And that's one of the great things about memoirs. We get to go on these journeys of uncomfortable discoveries, with people. But you also are, the benefit of memoir is that you don't know anyone better than you know yourself. So is writing fiction easier or harder, or is that not even a fair comparison?
That is, I've been thinking of it all this time since I started working on this novel. And I think the reason I wanted to write a novel was, there were several reasons, and I'll go to them in a few minutes. But I think I completely exposed myself in the first two memoirs. So I'm sure that there are still things if I wanted to, but I just wanted to try to make things up. And as you say, making things up could be easier, but it could also be more difficult. And in fact, after the first memoir, after Mountain of Crumbs, I had this novel in mind. I had this idea, and I was going to start working on the novel. But I received so many emails from the readers who asked me, what happened to this girl after she came to the United States? So they asked me to write a sequel, basically. And I just couldn't. I succumbed to their wishes, so to speak. And I also wanted, of course, to explore this the first years in the United States and the culture shock and all that. So I started writing the second memoir almost willingly, of course, but it wasn't the original plan. And then when the second memoir was written, then I still had that idea for a novel. And I did want to write this novel. The idea came from family history, but also from my sister's acting career. My sister was a prominent actress in Russia, and just as the protagonist of this novel, Sasha, my sister was as stubborn as Sasha and just as talented. She's my older sister. She's still alive, so I'm using the present tense. But she was an actress in Russia. She's no longer an actress. She lives in this country now. But she's 13 years older than me. And when I was growing up, she was already an adult, and she was an actress. And I was a teenager. I was extremely envious, of course, and jealous of her. And I wanted to be an actress myself. And I spent a lot of time in the backstage in her dressing room, backstage where in the theater, repertory theater, where she worked. And I was fascinated with the process of acting. I was fascinated with the theater, with this transformation, with the truth that the actors looked for. And the truth of art was juxtaposed to the lies of our everyday existence, because we lived in a dictatorship in the Soviet regime where everything that the government told us was a lie, and everyone knew that, including the government. But they kept lying to us anyway. It was this very schizophrenic existence. We sort of, you had to split your soul in half. One half was for your close friends and family where you could tell the truth, and the other half was for, at work, for everyone else, people you didn't know well. You pretended that everything was fine. And of course, everyone knew that nothing was fine. You pretended that we had enough food and there was everything, we're marching toward the bright future of communism, while in reality, everyone saw that there was nothing bright and there was no future. So that conflict was always present in our lives, the truth of art, the lives of everyday life. And that's what I wanted to explore. So that's sort of the basis for this novel, the idea of the novel that I wanted to write. It was my sister's acting career, and it was the family history. The novel is set during and after World War II. And in Russia, World War II is called the Great Patriotic War. And it's the glue, really. The war is still the glue that has held the country together, because 1 in every 7 Russians was killed in the war, was killed by the enemy. The loss of life was just immense. And it affected every family. Every family lost someone in the war, including mine. I had 2 uncles who I never met because they died before I was born, my mother's brothers, who both died in the war. And one of them was an artist, just like the uncle in the novel. So a lot of it was based on family history. And the what if questions, of course, came to mind. What if the real uncle died? But I thought, what if he didn't die? What if he survived? And, the girl, the protagonist, Sasha, who considered him her sort of a father figure, what if she finally connected with him? So I made that up. Yes, that was, couldn't be done in a memoir form. But your question is very interesting. Is it easier? Is it more difficult to write fiction than nonfiction? And is it even a question, as you said? When I wrote this novel and I submitted it to my agent, her response was, "This is not a novel, it's a memoir." So the draft that I submitted to her, which was not the first draft, of course, but it was for her,
sure,
was not fiction. It was not a novel. She said, it's a memoir. You have to make it work as a novel. And she was very helpful. My agent was just terrific. She gave me advice on how to fix it and how, what I needed to do. And I did it, and it took another year to introduce certain events, to change the plot, to complicate the plot, to introduce more characters who would allow certain things to happen in the plot. And then finally, after that year, I resubmitted it to her and she accepted it. And that's the novel that was published. There are certain things in fiction, making things up could be difficult, but they're also liberating because you can make anything up. Right. While in a memoir, you have to stick to the real events. Of course, in a memoir too, you make things up. You make up the dialogue, for example, because nobody remembers what people said exactly. But the line is set. The line of events is set. While in fiction, it's all, you make things up. But in this novel, in my novel, A Train to Moscow, a lot of it is based on autobiographical things on my family history, although I altered a lot of it too.
Excuse me. Have you shared the book with your sister?
Oh, yes. My sister was a part actually of the writing process. She helped me a great deal with the acting. with the understanding of the acting process and the transformation that actors go through when they become someone else. She gave me a lot of her own stories, and some of them I put in the book, some of the stories that worked. The childhood of the main character in a provincial town is the childhood that my sister had, more or less. A lot of it is the same. So she was very helpful with her stories and with her with giving me insight into the acting process, which I knew nothing about it. I have no acting talent, and I could never become an actress, but I wanted to understand it, and she was very helpful to provide this understanding for me.
Elena, as someone who grew up in Russia and then came to the United States and got an education, in the realities of what American life is like. When an American or someone in the Western world reads A Train to Moscow, what do you hope they see in this book that they couldn't see otherwise, because we haven't experienced what life in the Soviet Union was like? What do you kind of hope the reverse of your situation is like for American or Western readers?
Well, it's I didn't know that I was writing historical fiction, but this is what it is called. It's a historical novel. So my hope is that that American readers understand the time, the way that the war, what a loss of life it was for Russia. But I also would like American readers to feel viscerally what it was like to live in a totalitarian regime, and when you could not, when you had to pretend, and this pretending game, as I mentioned, that we all played, and the only truth that existed in the arts. It was acting, was telling the truth. Theater was the truth, as well as painting. The uncle was an artist. Painting told the truth, but the real life was based on a lie. The lie that we were told, the lie that we were forced to believe, and how. I hate to say how difficult it was. It wasn't difficult. It was just abnormal. Mm-hmm. It was this almost split schizophrenic personality that we all had, unfortunately, living in Soviet Russia. But the only road to freedom was offered by the arts. And that's if the readers could see that, if I was able to say that in the book, I would be very happy.
The book is A Train to Moscow. It is available everywhere now when you're hearing this, whether you like to shop at Amazon and or if you have a Kindle and that's your preferred way of reading, you can grab it either in physical form or Kindle or audiobook, or run down to your local bookstore and support local booksellers as well. A Train to Moscow came out yesterday when you're hearing this. Elena, I'm loving this book and recommending it to everyone. If people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you do, is there a place online they can connect with you?
Yes, I have a website. If you just put my name into Google, Elena Gorokhova, it will get you to the website. I'm also on Facebook and Twitter.
Excellent. I'm sorry.
Facebook and Twitter.
Great. We'll link up those places as well to make it easy for folks to find you. A Train to Moscow. Go grab it today. Elena, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Now stay tuned for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
I'm melting, cried Joey. Take the picture already. He stood with one arm around the bronze waist of the bewitched tribute statue, Samantha Stevens, riding a broom across a crescent moon. Jason tried in vain to frame the shot without any tourists in it, but that was impossible. From all points of the compass, a merry horde had arrived for Salem's 2-day summer psychic fair. All the commuter trains had burst open, like cornucopias filled beyond capacity, spilling endless fruits and nuts onto the red brick sidewalks of Essex Street. A vampiress in lavender shorts and feathered boots sold maple chocolate walnut fudge in front of the Witch City tattoo parlor. A near-naked gypsy in purple-green veils danced with a pheasant in her arms around a plug-in Hanukkah menorah. A fat man in a fetching blue jeans dress sold amethyst and citrine charm bracelets in front of Medusa Cafe, but his stand got knocked over by a one-armed crone driving a mobility scooter who sang "Choo-choo" as she passed, her stump on the wheel, her lipstick ghastly, her gnarled right hand raised in trailing plumes of noxious cigarette smoke. Chewbacca leapt out of her way and slapped sparks from his fur. He gave a disgruntled growl before going back to playing Summer Lovin' on his ukulele. The old one-armed dervish drove off, choo-choo, parting a crowd of wanderers, slack-jawed tourists with camera straps tight across their bellies, yellow-vested police on segways, elderly rollerbladers, face-painted infants and harried parents, and college girls. So many hot, hysterical college girls that you'd think somebody had napalmed a sorority house. Jason, are you deaf? Sorry. Jason raised the phone and took the shot. Joey inspected the photo and nodded in approval. Your turn. No, thanks. Do it, Shaggy. Don't make me hex you. Jason gave in and traded places. He put an arm around Samantha's metal back. Her bronze body had flushed in the afternoon sun, warm through his glove, but her eyes were weary. No, downright creepy. And her smile was forced, like a Disneyland princess who'd had her toe stomped. Say chowder, cried Joey, who'd been practicing his New England accent all morning. Come on, man. Say chowder. Fine, chowder. Joey got the shot, and Jason surrendered Samantha to a chubby kid wearing a Gandalf beard who climbed up to worship her bronze bosom.